What is going on, everybody? Welcome into the College Football Breakdown Show, Week 11. I'm going to be covering the DraftKings main slate here. We had 14 games, and 3 of them have been either postponed or canceled, so we have a little bit of a shorter slate here. First game up, we have TCU versus West Virginia. Not really a game I'm looking to target here. It has a pretty low game total. TCU's offense, I targeted them last week against Texas Tech, but Texas Tech's defense is nowhere near as good as West Virginia. West Virginia is pretty good on all 3 levels of the defense. As far as running back or quarterback, Max Duggan, again, he came through for us last week rushing the ball, but again, that's against a bad defense. I'm not really looking to target him. None of his wide receivers are really anything you should be targeting. And if you are looking at the running back, you might as well pay down and get Zach Evans, the stud freshman. He was a star recruit who's been getting more and more carries. You see he had 7 carries and 1 reception 1 week ago. Before that, 5 receptions, 1 carry. And he had 10 attempts last week. So his carries are going up. He didn't really have a big game, which I wanted him to. So you could say he didn't have a big game against Texas Tech. Why would he against West Virginia? And that would make sense, which is why I'm not looking to completely be too overweight on him. But again, with how talented he is and if he keeps getting carries, sooner or later he's probably going to have a big game. As far as West Virginia, so Jarrett Doege, their quarterback, throws one of the worst balls I've ever seen in my life. He's had some big games, but luckily, I didn't play too much of him last week against Texas. Even though he threw the ball 50 times, he only had 15 points. So their passing game really isn't something I look to very much. I think Willie Wright is definitely their main wide receiver. They pretty evenly split between Sam James and Ford Wheaton. And Simmons got some looks as well. So I'm not really too interested in those guys, even though I think Sam James is too cheap. He has had a rough year at 3.9, and he's had troubles with drops. So not too much interest in the passing game. I think Willie Wright, you see he's been over 9 points in each of his last 4 games, 25 points and 13-point games, also hidden in there. At the running back position is really where you need to point it out, because Letty Brown has been an absolute bell cow. He sees 25 touches a game when he does play. But we're not sure if he's going to play here. He got dinged up on the very first carry last week against Texas, and then they stuck him in there, and he still wasn't very effective. Of course, the 1 week I had a ton of Letty Brown. He got hurt on the very first carry. But anyway, I'd be monitoring to see if he does or does not play, because if he does not play, so as of right now, we have no news. That's a thing in college football. There just isn't enough news, especially with COVID going around. There aren't as much reporters there to give you up-to-date information, so you probably won't find out until, game time. So keep an eye on it. That's something I'm going to be keeping an eye on. I think even if he does play, Sinkfield, their backup, probably sees more work than he usually would, and he's had some decent games anyway, so at 3.3, he's way too cheap. If Letty Brown does not play, I will be probably 100% on Sinkfield. The TCU's defense is okay, but it's not like a shutdown defense by any means, and I think they can be more run on than they can be passed on, even though it's minimal difference. But Sinkfield, if Letty Brown doesn't play at 3.3, is absolutely something you should be looking at. Miami versus Virginia Tech. This is a game you're definitely going to want to target, but the prices are a little crazy. Should see a high game total. Miami's defense has kind of disappeared, as has Virginia Tech's defense for pretty much the whole season. You got 2 mobile quarterbacks in Derek King and Hendon Hooker. I think I like Derek King here. I'm not sure if I'm going to play him. Virginia Tech's team can be run on, and Derek King is the best rusher. Cameron Harris has kind of gone MIA over the last couple of weeks, and they're splitting carries with Knighton and Chaney. Knighton and Chaney maybe at that cheap price point, but there's not really anything you can bank on. So if I am attacking this team, I would be looking for King to have a huge rushing game. He had a huge game throwing the ball last week, 54 points, obviously. Hopefully you played him. I think that was a Friday slate. Maybe it was Thursday. But it depends on if Brevin Jordan is out again this week. We don't have any confirmation. Sounds like he's trying to play at 4.6K. He's their tight end, one of the best tight ends in college football. If he is not going to play, then Mark Pope and Mike Harley are fine plays, especially Mike Harley. I think Harley might be a fine play anyway. He has 4 touchdowns in his last 3 games. And when Brevin Jordan was out, let's see these 2 games. 18 catches and over 300 yards. 3 touchdowns in the last 2 games. Over 36 DraftKings points in each of those. So I think Mike Harley is not expensive enough They are finally starting to throw the ball to these wide receivers. I think that continues even if Jordan plays. I think Harley is the guy to look to. I think Pope is fine at 4.6, especially if Jordan doesn't play. If Jordan plays, I'll probably have some of him at 4.6. That's as far down as I'd be looking to go. Will Mallory, the tight end, he could catch a touchdown if Jordan sits. He's a very talented tight end. You can see his game logs. When Jordan's not playing, very good. I would only play him if Jordan sits. As far as Virginia Tech, big news for them. Their running back, Khalil Herbert, was injured last week. Of course, again, I haven't had much Herbert ownership, and I had some shares of him last week, and then he gets hurt, of course. So I would expect him not to play, but as of right now, it's unsure. So who knows? If he doesn't play, I think Raheem Blackshear at 3.4 has to be mentioned as a cheap option. He is a transfer from Rutgers. He can catch it more than... I'm surprised he doesn't have that many receptions on the year. He's really good out of the backfield. But he can also run it a little bit as well. So I think mainly Hendon Hooker gains rushing value if Herbert doesn't play, but Blackshear at 3.4 is too cheap versus a Miami team that just gave up, 40 points to NC State? Hendon Hooker is fantastic at 9.7, but that price is really prohibitive. I'm not sure if I'm going to play him. I would rather play up for Derek King, personally. I think he has more explosive capabilities, but so yeah, that's expensive for my liking, but I think he could have a big game. As far as the passing game, it really depends. If James Mitchell is out, I actually might play some Trey Turner and Tavian Robinson. These guys are pretty interchangeable. I think Trey Turner has a little bit more deep play ability, but they don't throw the ball to the wide receivers all that much. So maybe plug them in here and there, but other than that, you shouldn't really be targeting their wide receivers, which is one reason why I don't usually love paying up for Hooker, because he does not have great stacking options. Moving along, Indiana versus Michigan State. It's kind of hard to read Michigan State because, quite frankly, they're not very good. But it's kind of hard to read how good their defense is. They looked very poor against Iowa last week, so I would assume Michigan State is more leaning towards the poor side than they are being any good. So Indiana, I will have ownership interest in Indiana on all levels this week. Michigan State has a better passing off defense than they do rushing defense, so I think Stevie Scott is firmly in play. This guy is a bell cow. He sees touchdowns. He's been doing it for years and years and years. He's going to see over 20 carries, and if he gets you over 100 yards and he gets you the touchdowns, which he absolutely could in this matchup, I think at 7.2 is a fantastic play. I think Michael Penix Jr. is maybe turning it around. He looks... I don't want to say turning it around because Indiana's had a great year, but their offense has been scoring more points than you would probably expect due to a lot of the, if you look deeper at the numbers. So while he does have 29 points in each of his last two games, he hasn't really been running the ball as much as I would like to see. You can see there he's barely has positive on the positive side in the rushing totals. So I think he could throw the ball, and I think he does have cheap stacking options. So I'll play some of him. I think he's fine. Whop Phillier is an absolute target hog. He had 11 receptions last game, and that's something he did last year. He just had games where, he had 12 catches. So at 6.1K, that's way too cheap. I think I will have interest in Whop once again here. I mentioned last week Ty Freifogel, their second wide receiver, was too cheap, and he repaid me with a touchdown. But then his price jumped. So he was at 4.3. He had a very, very good game, 30 points. So I was very happy with him last week. But I think Whop is clearly the better option. But he is more expensive, so I think either one of those guys are fine. Definitely a clear preference for Whop. And Peyton Hendershot is one of the best tight ends in all of college football as well. A little bit underpriced. It's 4.3. I think everybody in this offense is slightly underpriced. But I think I like Freifogel and Phillier better. But as a lineup filler, I do not hate Hendershot. As far as Michigan State's, Rocky Lombardi finally crushed down to earth. He's not a good quarterback. At 6,000, I could see why you might have ownership interest. You could look at he had a good game against Rutgers and a good game against Michigan. I just think that was fluky, to be honest with you. I don't think he's very good. I think the 4-point game we saw last week is more of what you're going to see going forward. Running the ball, they spread the carries out too much to be interested in. And so if I skip over a team's positional unit, that basically means I'm not interested at all. Doesn't mean if I'm playing 150 lineups, I may not have a piece here and there, but I don't play 150 lineups. I try to give you information that'll help you here. But if you're trying to look at a team that gives 4 different guys carries, 3 different guys carries, in a game that they're supposed to lose, I'm not really sure what your strategy there is. So Yeah, I'm just skipping over it. As far as the wide receivers, Ricky White had the huge game against Michigan, but he's had one catch in each of his other 2 games. So I think the top 2 guys are Naylor and Reed. I actually think their price points are pretty good here. I might own them here or there. They both had 12 targets last week. They're both probably NFL talents. I think Naylor is hotter because last week he had a huge game, 119 yards. He's been pretty consistent. But Jaden Reed, even with all those targets, he didn't really do anything. I'll have to double check and make sure that was right. I thought he had 12 targets last week and only 1 reception. That would be bad, so maybe I'll double check that. But he definitely sees the second most targets. I would be more interested in Naylor and some of Reed since he is cheaper. But again, not going to go crazy on Michigan State. I think they're a very bad football team this year. All right, Penn State versus Nebraska. Moving on. Both of these teams have been super disappointing here. As far as Penn State goes, their offense, they still are running a pretty high tempo, and I think they might be able to score here. Nebraska has faced some good offenses, so it's hard to tell exactly how good their defense is, which is why I'm struggling here. I would lean that they're better at stopping the pass than they are stopping the run. So Sean Clifford, I wouldn't have too much ownership interest in him here. Even though he does run the ball, he keeps returning value. Even if it's not pretty, he keeps returning value. At 8.3K, I think that might be a little bit too expensive for me. But if you're just looking at it like, hey, this guy scores a lot of points each and every week, I think that's fine. Penn State's running game has not taken off at all this year. It's been very poor, much poorer than anyone expected. We thought it would be like a machine where year in and year out they just churn out fantastic performances on the ground, but this year it has come to a grinding halt. A lot of that is due to the game script, yes. And while this one should see a better game script, they're favored by 3 points in this one. I'm not sure if I want to go back to the well with Devin Ford. I had way too much Devin Ford last week, and he had 3 points. So I think he's fine at 5.4. You should definitely make a case for it. So if your head's been under a rock and you haven't been paying attention, they lost their other 3 top running backs, and now Devin Ford is the guy. I mentioned that they give these 5-star guys, Kayvon Lee and Holmes, Keziah Holmes, they get some carries out of the backfield as well. But as of right now, the ground game isn't doing well enough for me to target those guys. They need to be playing a lot better. I thought last week would be the week against Maryland, and if it wasn't against Maryland, I wouldn't think it would be against Nebraska. As far as the receivers, the top 3 guys are very interesting. Jahan Dotson obviously is a total beast. This guy's been going for 30 points pretty much every single game. 19 points, 43 points, 30 points. He's been an absolute stud. He's been a target hog. He's their clear number 1 option. At 8.8K, that is super expensive. I'm not sure I will get there, but I can't really talk you out of it if you can somehow afford him. As far as the other 2 guys, Freiermuth sees the second most targets, and then Washington is below him. Parker Washington at 4.4K kind of had a breakout game last week. He had 14 targets, and he was pretty effective with them. 8 receptions for 70 yards and 2 touchdowns. The thing is, they badly needed another wide receiver to step up. Freiermuth is a tight end. They badly needed another outside threat to step up, and it looks like they might have that in Parker Washington. So at 4.4K, that's way, way, way too cheap. There's no way he should be half of Dotson's price. Freiermuth, the tight end, week in and week out. This guy's viable. I don't think he has quite as high of a ceiling as these other 2, but definitely worth a mention and worth a look. All right, Middle Tennessee versus Marshall. Marshall has been rolling, and they have one of the best defenses in all of college football, especially at a Power 5 level, while Middle Tennessee has been absolutely terrible this year. Middle Tennessee, Asher O'Hara is a great dual threat. Usually at 6.6K, that would be like an auto play, especially in a super flex for me. You can see some of his performances, but look who that's against. Rice, Western Kentucky, UTSA. I think Marshall is a significantly better defense than those teams. I would not be surprised at all if Middle Tennessee scores like 10 points in this game. Is there a chance they get like 17 points, maybe even all the way up to 20? Of course there is, and Asher O'Hara could return value, so at 6.6K, I'm not totally crossing him off, especially due to that rushing upside. But Marshall is allowing 63 rushing yards on the ground per game, and that's just not really something I'm looking to with O'Hara. I don't really see why you would play their wide receivers. However, they are mispriced. It is worth it. Jaron Pierce is their best wide receiver, and he is at 3.8K, so maybe as a lineup filler. All right, Marshall. So Middle Tennessee has a better passing defense than they do rushing defense. Just don't see why you would pay all the way up for Grant Wells in a game they're supposed to blow him out. I guess they're probably going to score a lot of points, so maybe he throws a couple touchdowns. I don't hate a Marshall stack at all. If I'm stacking them with the wide receivers, Artie Henry is probably their top guy, but he's definitely priced up there. Brock Thompson, I'm assuming, is missing this game. We don't really have an update, so I would check to make sure if he's going to play or not, because if he doesn't, Xavier Gaines at 3.9K, the tight end, probably sees a slight uptick in targets. He's one of the better tight ends in college football. Fantasy-wise, at 3.9K, he's too cheap. So I actually think Gaines is the best priced option here. Gamage, however you say that, at 4.7K, would be their secondary outside wide receiver threat if Thompson sits. But I think price per at a price point, I like Xavier Gaines at 3.9K. As far as the running back, that's where I'm going to have a ton of ownership. Brendan Knox, even though he's very expensive, I would fire him up. He's really leading this backfield in the game. They should dominate. He should get a lot of carries, a lot of workload. I really like Brendan Knox. This guy Evans, their backup, Sheldon Evans. I actually played him way back in week 1, week 0 against Eastern Kentucky because they don't even show his salary. He was min priced, and they usually Marshall likes to split carries, and he did actually get a touchdown, but he's been very ineffective with his carries this year, and it's been different than some of these other Marshall teams because Brendan Knox has really taken over. He's the clear bell cow for this team. All right, Wake versus North Carolina. Let's start with North Carolina. Week in and week out, their offense has just been producing on all levels. And Wake does not have a good defense. So you could do a full North Carolina stack. All of their guys are in play, is what I'll say. All of them are in play. In a game that they're 13-point favorites, the game that they should win. Sam Howell, the volume is not great. You look at that volume, the attempts, is not where I would normally want to be if I'm paying up $8,000. $8,000 is not a terrible price, but again, that's pretty expensive for a guy who doesn't have a huge workload. He has been very effective in the amount of passes that he has been throwing, so he's probably going to be effective here against Wake. But again, the workload keeps me from going 100% in. As far as the wide receivers, De'Ami Brown is the top guy. He had a miserable week last week. 4 points, but that was coming off a huge performance where he had 240 yards and 3 touchdowns. So he's their clear top guy at 7.1K. Daz Newsome, I said last week he's dead to me. He's just let me down so many times, but he's doing some. He had a good week last week, but he's just hasn't been explosive at all. He's catching almost no passes that go for over 20 yards, which is a lot different than last year. So at 4.3, he's still too cheap, but he's kind of dead to me at this point. Maybe a lineup filler. Bo Corrales, their outside guy, is down, and that opens up some opportunities for Coffrey Brown and Simmons. Coffrey Brown has been very dynamic when he gets the ball, but he never gets the ball. 1 catch each in his last 4 games, so I don't really see how you can target somebody like that. But Simmons at 3.5K is too cheap. I played some of him last week. He had 67 yards. I was fine with that as a lineup filler for a guy who was close to min price. He probably catches a few passes. I think he's saying about 4 targets per game, 4.5 targets per game when Corrales sits. And while that's not fantastic in this high-powered offense, I think he's way too cheap at 3.5K. So I will have some of Simmons. As far as running the ball, you should know by now Javonte Williams. He has 17 touchdowns on the year. He breaks 1 million tackles every single game. The workload is not crazy, but he's already proven by now he doesn't need a typical workload to pay off his price. So at 9.5, that's really, really expensive. Maybe I'll get there in a few lineups, but it's very expensive. Again, I've missed out on having him some weeks because I said the exact same thing. So I don't want to completely fade him. I chose to do a few weeks, I admit, and it did not pay off. That being said, Michael Carter, their other running back, there's no way this guy should be this much cheaper. He has been very effective himself. 28 points last week. I played some of him. He's just been too cheap. He's been too cheap all year in this high-powered offense where two backs are fantasy relevant. He also catches the ball out of the backfield, and against Wake, you're going to want to target some of these guys. I think Carter, if you can't afford Javonte Williams, I'm always fine with Carter. As far as the Wake side of things, North Carolina's defense has not been fantastic. Sam Hartman, I played Sam Hartman here and there. At 5.5K, maybe I could play him again. I might, here and there. But I'm not going to go crazy because he just hasn't been very good this year. Their passing offense has not been great. Their running offense has been fantastic, but they haven't been able to throw the ball like they normally have, like we saw them do with Jamie Newman last year. If you're pairing Hartman with anybody or you want to play a one-off, I think Ja'Cory Roberson at 4.9K is way, way, way too cheap. I will have a lot of Ja'Cory Roberson. In a year where almost nobody gets consistent targets, Ja'Cory Roberson has been getting consistent targets for Wake. He's been the standout in that area. He's had some big games, as you can see. Even if he doesn't have a big game at 4.9K, I think he has a safe enough floor. Devontae Green would be their secondary option. I think this guy's really talented, but he's had a disappointing year. He's burned me a few times, but he's been okay, as we see here. So at 4.1K, I think he also is too cheap. Morin had 11 targets last week. I think he plays in the slot. He had 11 targets, but he didn't do much with them, and he hasn't really done much this year. So I'm not really interested in Morin, but if you're chasing targets, maybe something changed in the offense. A.T. Perry is coming back. He's more of an outside guy. Looks like he's listed on the depth chart. Maybe he plays. I wouldn't be that interested in him, even if he does play. That might knock me off Green a little bit, but I think Roberson is pretty safe regardless. So maybe I'll play it safe and just mostly go Roberson here. As far as rushing the ball, they have a running back by committee pretty much with Walker and Beal Smith. I am a huge fan of Walker. I think he's a very good running back, and he's been getting all the touchdowns for this team. Not all the touchdowns, but the majority of them. He's been the more fantasy relevant one, but he is not seeing many more carries than Beal Smith to be priced that much above Beal Smith. So I can't see justify paying all the way up for Walker. Of course, I say that in a game where he's playing against Javonte Williams, the same guy who I keep saying, well, he's getting all the touchdowns, but look at the workload, and then he just makes me look like an idiot each and every week. So maybe both Javonte Williams and Walker do the same thing, kind of similar in that regards, except Javonte Williams is obviously just better. But anyway. Beal Smith at 4.2 is too cheap. He's been pretty effective almost every game. Even when he doesn't have a big game, he still sees, at least 12 carries and has a good enough game. So maybe. I think Wake UNC, a full game stack, makes sense if you're into that sort of thing. Absolutely, especially with how cheap the Wake guys are. Throw one or two of them. Throw at least two of them coming back if you're going to do a game stack. All right, USC versus Arizona. I'm going to have a ton of USC this week. I had a lot of USC last week, and it looked like it was going to burn me. They finally came through at the end. They got very lucky. So I still don't know how much I would take from that. I think Arizona State has a very good defense, and Arizona does not. And they ran almost 100 plays last week. They still run up-tempo. I wish they would stop trying to run the ball as much as they are trying to run the ball because they're not good at running the ball. They haven't been for a while. And they split the ball between 4 different backs, mainly Step, Malapai, and Carr. I didn't see the field last week, but he should. He's good. So, no thank you at the running backs, but the passing game, I'm going to go right back to it. I'm not going to necessarily own Slovis like 100% like I did last week, but Arizona, USC should score over 40 points. I'll be very surprised if they don't score 40 points here. I bet on the minus 14 as well. And they're still too cheap. They're wide receivers at least. So even if you don't want to stack them with Slovis, you could still play them as one-offs because they're too cheap. Amon-Ra St. Brown, I think, is the guy I like best at 6.7K. Should see targets all year. But all three of these guys are going to be fantasy relevant. Drake London was an absolute beast out of the slot. He's a mismatch on every single play. These teams don't know how to match up with him. So at 5.8K, never going to talk you out of Drake London. Tyler Vaughns was the only one of these guys who didn't have a very good game last week. He still had 11 points, but he didn't look good. He lost a fumble. I think he's probably still going to have a pretty good year. At 4.2K, I think if you're down on Vaughns, I'm down on Vaughns a little bit just because he didn't look great. It was only one game in after a weird off season. But I think the other guys are cheap enough where you could just fade Vaughns if you want to. I think all these guys are fine. Brew McCoy, their fourth wide receiver at 4,000. Drake London was fantasy relevant last year as the team's fourth wide receiver. So I think Brew McCoy is going to have his spots here and there as well. Oh. There we go. So I think he will have his spots as well. He did have 5 catches, 51 yards. He's an athletic freak. If you don't know Brew McCoy, athletic freak coming out of high school. Took him forever to play, but he's finally playing. And he is in the perfect offense to be fantasy relevant. All right, as far as Arizona, They're way too cheap. Actually, a full game stack here isn't the worst thing in the world either. Grant Cannell at 5.9K. Oh, it was only 5.7K, excuse me. PFF loved this dude when he came in for Khalil Tate. They had him graded really highly. He doesn't run the ball as much as I would like to see. At 5.7K, though, USC's defense isn't fantastic. So he's fine. I don't really know if I would stack him with anybody because their wide receiving core is a mess. Joyner, I think he's the best guy. Converted quarterback. Had the best year of these guys. It was him, then Castile, then Cunningham. But their depth chart's a mess. I think Booby Curry, at 3.3K. He was a talented freshman, but he did almost nothing last year. Supposedly he's a starter if you look at the depth chart, but their depth charts are not trustworthy, Arizona's. So I might just fully fade the wide receiving core. If you want, I think it's just getting too cute, personally, but a few of these guys probably return value, and Joyner's probably the guy I trust the most. I'm probably not going to play the running backs much. Gary Brightwell has been pretty talented, has shown a lot while he's been on the field, or he's shown that he is talented, but he's the kind of guy where year in and year out, people keep saying, oh, he's gonna have a big year if he gets carries, and then he always just looks pretty good, but the stats aren't there, so maybe I'll make him prove it to me before I play him, but I do think he is too cheap at 5.2K. All right, Louisville versus Virginia. I am definitely interested in this game. Virginia's defense is okay. Louisville's defense is not good. As far as Louisville, you can usually throw on this Virginia team more than you can run on them, but I think Louisville's going to have success regardless, and Javian Hawkins is their clear bell cow. So I expect to see points in this one, and I think Hawkins at 8.3K, while that's not a fantastic price, I mean, look at his game log, 40 points, 37 points. I played him each of those weeks and felt very good about it, especially the 40-point one. So he's okay at 8.3K. Definitely do worse if you're paying up. Cunningham, I don't think I'm going to pay up at 8.1K. He just hasn't quite looked right to me. Malik, the quarterback formerly known as McHale. The volume's not really there in the passing game. It's been better this year, but he does run the ball. It looks like he's been doing better running the ball, so I think you could do worse at 8.1K, but I like the quarterback on the other side who is cheaper, which I will mention in a second. Tutu Atwell's too cheap. I think I'm going to play Tutu Atwell this week. He's their clear number one guy. He has big play threat. There's nothing not to love. His price is good. Fitzpatrick, I played him last week, 4.4K. He's their second wide receiver. He's had a very down year, but he had a really good game last time out with 29.8 fantasy points on DraftKings. So he's fine. I think both those guys are fine. I like Atwell. All right, as far as Virginia, way too cheap. Brendan Armstrong, their quarterback, 6.5K. I'm not sure why he's priced like that. He's a dual threat guy. He is probably going to play, but he is dinged up. That's worth mentioning. Look at all those rushing numbers. That's beautiful. That's something you want to see. This Louisville team, you can definitely run on this Louisville team, and Virginia doesn't really have running backs to target. Tualapapa is cheap, but has not really done anything. So I think where I would target this game, since he's only 6.5K, why not just target Brendan Armstrong? So if I get word he's playing, I'm definitely playing him. I expect him to play. Sounds like he's just dinged up. He gets dinged up a lot because he runs like a fullback and he just takes hits like crazy. This Virginia offense has been looking a lot better to me recently, especially under Armstrong. They look like crap without Armstrong. But yeah, he's a beast. 6.5K, that's way too cheap. All right, as far as the wide receivers go, Lavelle Davis is probably their top guy, but he's been out for a while. Sounds like he's trying to play, probably will play. I think I'm not going to pay up there at 6.3K with him coming off injury. Billy Kemp sees a lot of targets. He's more of a cash game guy. He hasn't really thrown any big play ability. He has had some good games, and he is pretty consistent, so at 6.2, he's fine. But all four of these guys, Poljan and Jana as well, are pretty good for their price point. They just spread the ball out a little bit too much for me to know who's going to have a good game. I would use more of these guys in cash. It's just really tough to call. I think Poljan's pretty touchdown dependent, but he's been getting those touchdowns. So I can't talk you off any of those top four guys, Poljan, Jana, Kemp, or Davis. I personally wouldn't play Davis up there. I don't know if I'd pay up for Kemp, so mainly Jana or Poljan to fill out a lineup I think is okay. But again, I'm really going to be targeting Armstrong if I'm on the Virginia side. All right, Notre Dame versus Boston College. Obviously, Notre Dame coming off that big upset win. I think they're fine this week. It's a little bit of a letdown spot, however. Ian Book, week in and week out, he's pretty good. Doesn't really have. he has a pretty safe floor, but not a very high ceiling, I guess is what I would say. So I'm not sure how much I'm going to own of any Notre Dame player, especially Book. He can run the ball, though, and he is somewhat consistent, pretty consistent. So I don't really think the volume's going to be there, however. Kyron Williams at 8.9K is just an absolute beast, an absolute stud. You saw what he did last week against Clemson. But he's way too expensive, in my opinion, at 8.9K, where he does see a pretty good workload, but it's not exactly an elite workload. So he's fine at 8.9. I don't really know if I'm going to play him. I think he's super, super, super talented, as we saw. So I can't really knock you too much if you do play him. As far as as far as the wide receivers go, Ben Skowronek is the highest priced guy. I don't know if I'd pay up to get him. He's had some okay games. I think where I would go in this one, so Braden Lenzy is still doubtful. McKinley might play. I think McKinley's okay at 4.2K, but the injury thing scares me a little bit. It looks like he practiced concussion. Yikes. Sounds like he might play. Tough to tell. I think if he does play, he's fine. I think Avery Davis at 3.9K is the best price point. This guy's very talented. He gives them a vertical threat they haven't really had this year. They've been hurting for athletes on the outside catching the ball, especially with Lenzy hurt. And Avery Davis has really stepped up as of late. Had a good game against Clemson. Almost had another touchdown that he just let slip out of his fingers, but it was a pretty good play. So I think Avery Davis is going to probably keep going up and up and up. Overall, these wide receivers aren't like main targets of mine. I just think they have a good price point in the game that they should score some touchdowns. But that's why they're priced like they are. I think it's somewhat of a reasonable price. I still think they're a little too cheap, which is why I have some interest, but it's not like a super mega value or anything like that. Michael Mayer, Baby Gronk, their tight end. I played him last week, and he's fine. He's been very good. He's been coming on strong as of late. I don't think he's like a main play or anything, but still he's too cheap at 3.7K to fill out a lineup. He might catch a touchdown for you. On the Boston College side of thing, they're too cheap. Notre Dame obviously has a very good defense, so I'm not going to go crazy with Boston College, but they were just way too cheap. I mean, Jerkovic, Notre Dame transfer, actually, he's been pretty darn good this year, especially when he runs the ball, but he doesn't do that very often. You see that Pitt game, minus 42 rushing yards. That's pretty funny. But he's been losing fumbles every game too. That's a worry. And the targets are going down, the attempts are going down, which is the reason why I may not own too much of him at 5.4K. I think I still will have some of him because I think he's too good to be that cheap, even going against a good defense. But they've somehow kind of turned back into a ground and pound team as of late, which was not expected because they had completely changed from ground and pound to airing it out, and now they're kind of switching it back. So mid-season, so it's really hard to tell what's going on. Which would mean I would have some interest in David Bailey if that was the case, but not against this Notre Dame defense. That's first in stuff rate. Absolutely not. So that leads their pass catchers, with that in mind, of them changing gears to running the ball more, up in the air. I think Zay Flowers I'll still have. Well, I don't know how much I'll have. They're playing Notre Dame, but I've played him a few times this year, and he's been really good to me. Especially that Pitt game, 43 points. He's been very consistent. He's been seeing about 10 targets per game, and he's an athlete, man. This guy can break a deep touchdown at any point. So he's fine. Hunter Long, 5.1K, their tight end. His targets have been going down and down and down, so I don't think I'll play him, but he is still one of the more fantasy-relevant tight ends. I think he's a little bit too expensive. I think there are better tight ends who are cheaper. I've tried to mention them as we've gone along. Guys like Meyer, Hendershot, guys like that. All right, Baylor, Texas Tech. I actually didn't see this one over here when I was prepping, so I don't really have anything prepped for this one. I thought it was among the cancellations, but it's not. So, Texas Tech's defense is not good, but Baylor's offense has been also not good this year. I think Charlie Brewer's too cheap at 6.2K. Any quarterback, especially if he has some running ability, going against this Texas Tech defense has to be mentioned. However, they've been so bad this year, I don't know how much I'm going to want to have. The wide receiving core has been an absolute mess. You see two probables. RJ Sneed's been the best one at 5K if you need a cheap stack with Brewer. You could do worse than that, certainly. Game logs look pretty good. 21 points last time out. He's been getting better as the year has gone on. Running backs, I will never play a Baylor running back until they prove me otherwise. They rotate too much. Plus, these guys were like trying to opt out. Now they opted back in. It's a mess. Anyway, I think Brewer and Snead. I think if you're paying down, you're getting cheap. You're just getting too cute with playing a bad offense. I mean, they're playing a bad defense, and might as well just go with Brewer at the super flex if you're going to play it. As far as Texas Tech, their offense has not been very good lately, and Baylor's defense is pretty good. I'll probably end up betting Baylor in this one. +1, last I checked. Columbia yet to eclipse 300 yards passing. 8 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. That's just not good. So I'd want to see them get better before I played them. They do have a number of wide receivers who are okay, but again, they spread it out too much to tell who's going to get the ball. Ezukama, Carter, Vasher, Price. Hard to tell. Now Polk's somewhat involved. Rigged in if he's back. It's a mess, guys. It's a mess. For what it's worth, I think Ezukama is the better one of these guys. The best wideout amongst the group, and he's the one I played the most often, and he's been okay to me, but overall I've been pretty much avoiding this team. I don't really want to spend too much time on them because I don't like them. So Roderick Thompson is at 5.1K. Too cheap, but like I mentioned last week, he's just going to entice you with his price point until you take a look at his game logs and realize he really hasn't done anything. He just feasts on bad teams like he did earlier on in the year, and his workload has never been very fantastic. So not much ownership interest there. All right, as far as quarterbacks, I've positional overview here. I've gone over every game. As far as quarterbacks, I don't know if I'll get to King, but if I pay up, I'd probably pay up for King. I'll have some Slovis. Howell, if you're stacking. Penix at 7.2. Could definitely do worse than that. Not much interest in the mid 6K range. Oh, except for Armstrong. Absolutely Armstrong. Love Armstrong. O'Hara at 6.6 is okay. Brewer at 6.2 is okay. Gunnell at 5.7. And then the cheap guys I mentioned earlier, Hartman and Jerkovic. I would lean Hartman between those two. As far as running back, I'm probably going to pay up for Knox. I think Javonte Williams is better than Kyron Williams from a fantasy perspective if I'm paying up. Hawkins, 8.3, can't talk you out of that. Stevie Scott, 7.2, I really like that. Not much interest in the middle. Oh, I skipped Nebraska. I'll get to Nebraska. But there are those cheap running backs I mentioned earlier, like Sinkfield, that I might have some interest in. Wide receivers. I mean, Dotson's really expensive. I don't really know if I'm going to pay up there. I'll have a lot of St. Brown. I'll have a lot of Atwell. Harley, maybe. De'Ami Brown, maybe, if I'm stacking. Watt Fillier, I will have some Watt Fillier at 6.1K. Drake London at 5.8K. I really like the upper mid-range here in the wide receivers. That's probably mostly where my interest is going to be. I'm not going to go through all the cheap guys because they're kind of hard to find one by one. But yeah, that kind of wraps it up. I'll go over Nebraska real quick. The big news here, quarterback Adrian Martinez got the bench at the end of the week. Let me preface this by saying I have been super anti-Adrian Martinez over his tenure at Nebraska. While his running ability has always kept me somewhat intrigued, this guy sucks at throwing the ball. I'm sorry, but unless he drastically improves, he's not good enough at throwing the ball. And I think they realized that. So Christian McCaffrey's brother, Luke McCaffrey, came in, did better than Martinez throwing the ball, but he also threw a pick. I think that one was in the end zone. I think they both threw interceptions in the end zone. And he can run as well. So if Luke McCaffrey is announced as the starter, right now we have no word at 5.2K. That's way too cheap. I will play Luke McCaffrey some. I am definitely worried if he comes out not looking great against Penn State. While they haven't been good, they're 0-3. They're good enough to make a quarterback look bad who hasn't really started before. I don't think McCaffrey's ever started in college. So I am worried he might get benched or pulled just like Martinez did last week. As far as running back, Mills at 5.7, I think it's too cheap. I think he's okay. Maybe I'll play him a little bit. But he hasn't been super effective, and I think their running backs really vulture a lot of the touchdowns. So I'm not sure what the upside is here, but he does catch some passes, and he's their clear number one guy. And as far as wide receivers, nobody has done anything. Wendell Robinson would be the guy to look at. I'd be way more interested in him if they were giving him rushes. Last year, he was like a running back wide receiver hybrid. This year, they said they're going to transition him so they can limit the amount of hits that he takes. So they're going to make him a full-time wide receiver. Probably good for his development, but through 3 games, he has less than, or maybe they've only played 2. However many they've played, he doesn't even have 100 yards receiving, but he is so talented at 5K, he could break one for sure. Omar Manning, I would have interest in at 3.3, but he hasn't done anything. He wasn't playing. I think he played last week. I haven't watched the tape, but he has no fantasy points. So until he shows me that, I probably won't play him. But at 3.3K, if you're like looking for a super cheap guy and you think you have an edge, I would be checking the news to see if he's going to play and make sure he's listed on the depth chart starting. But yeah, I thought he was worth mentioning. All right, folks, that wraps it up. That's my breakdown. That's my preview. As always, give it a like if you are appreciating what I'm doing here. I'm just trying to give you information. I'll tell you some of the guys I'm playing. That doesn't necessarily mean those are the only guys you should play. That's just me giving information, giving you an idea of what I'm doing. I do every week. I post my my CFF notes on Twitter. So give me a follow on Twitter. It's in the link, Yonkers CFB on Twitter. Give me a follow, and I'll kind of post some more breakdowns once I kind of am able to sort out all this information and look at lineups and whatnot. I'll kind of post my notes there, what I'm thinking of, who to pay up for, what lineup construction I might look at. Am I paying up for wide receiver this week, running back this week, etc. That's more well thought out once I kind of condense this information that I'm giving here, and once I kind of actually put it into practice. Right now I have like no lineups, and I might have one, but I haven't really done much as far as the actual constructing is concerned. All right, fellas, thanks for listening. Give a subscribe if you like what I'm doing here, and I will see you all next week. Good luck.